the Slumbering Flight. I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum of the airplane engines filled my ears as I blinked, trying to orient myself. I was on a flight, but something felt off. Glancing around, I noticed that every passenger and crew member was fast asleep. The silence was eerie, broken only by the steady drone of the engines. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up, my legs wobbly from the prolonged inactivity. I made my way down the aisle, gently shaking passengers, trying to wake them. But no matter how hard I tried, they remained in a deep slumber. Panic began to set in as I realized the gravity of the situation. I rushed to the front of the plane, desperate to find someone who could help. I knocked on the cockpit door, but there was no response. Using all my strength, I managed to force the door open, only to find the pilots unconscious, slumped over the controls. The autopilot light glowed, indicating that the plane was flying on its own. I tried to make sense of the various buttons and switches, but my limited knowledge of aviation left me helpless. I attempted to use the radio to contact air traffic control, but the signal was dead. I was completely cut off from the outside world. As I returned to the cabin, a sense of unease washed over me. The plane seemed to be flying smoothly, but for how long? I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play. Shadows danced in my peripheral vision, and the overhead lights flickered intermittently. I tried to rationalize the strange occurrences, attributing them to my sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I remained awake, the more convinced I became that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Hours passed, and the plane continued its course through the endless expanse of the sky. I watched helplessly as the fuel gauge steadily decreased, knowing that our time was running out. I searched the plane for any clues or signs of what had caused this bizarre phenomenon, but found nothing. Exhaustion and despair began to take hold of me. I slumped into a seat, my eyes heavy with fatigue. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever wake up again. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sound of applause. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself surrounded by passengers clapping and cheering. I looked out the window and realized that we had landed safely at our destination. Confusion and relief washed over me simultaneously. Had it all been a dream? A vivid, terrifying nightmare? As I gathered my belongings and disembarked the plane, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened on that flight. I scoured the internet for any reports of similar incidents, but found nothing. The airline assured me that the flight had been uneventful and that all passengers and crew had arrived safely. But deep down, I knew that something had occurred on that plane, something that defied explanation. The memory of those haunting hours continued to plague me, leaving me questioning the nature of reality and the fragility of the human mind. As I boarded my next flight, I couldn't help but wonder if history would repeat itself. Would I wake up to find myself trapped in another waking nightmare, or would I finally be able to put the unsettling experience behind me? Only time would tell. Vanished. Flight 753 from Istanbul to London was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet over a notorious stretch of airspace known for its instability. In the cockpit, Captain James Thompson and First Officer Michael Stevens monitored the instruments, everything normal. But in an instant, without warning, the plane vanished from radar screens. Air traffic controllers frantically tried to re-establish contact, but there was only eerie silence. Search and rescue teams were dispatched, scouring the rugged terrain below for any sign of the missing aircraft. But as hours stretched into days, no trace was found, no wreckage, no emergency beacon, nothing. It was as if Flight 753 had simply ceased to exist. Inside the plane, the passengers were blissfully unaware of the growing crisis. They dozed, watched movies, and chatted quietly, assuming they were still on course for London. But as the hours ticked by and the flight stretched far longer than scheduled, a sense of unease began to ripple through the cabin. Whispers turned to worried questions. Why hadn't they landed yet? Where were they? The flight attendants, trained to project calm, could only offer vague reassurances, but even they were beginning to feel the first tendrils of fear. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson and First Officer Stevens worked frantically to understand their situation. The instruments showed them on course, but the endless expanse of ocean below told a different story. They tried to contact air traffic control, but were met with only static. A creeping realization took hold they were lost, flying blind, with no idea where they were or how to get back on track. As the truth of their predicament spread through the cabin, panic began to set in. Passengers demanded answers, but the flight crew had none to give. They were as much in the dark as everyone else. Some passengers wept quietly, clutching photos of loved ones they feared they might never see again. Others paced the aisles, their agitation growing with each passing minute. A group of men began to angrily bang on the locked cockpit door, demanding to speak to the captain, but no response came. In the galley, the flight attendants huddled together, trying to maintain a facade of calm even as their own fears mounted. They rationed the remaining food and water, unsure how long they would need to make it last. As the hours dragged on and fuel ran low, a grim reality settled over the passengers and crew. They were utterly alone, cut off from the world below, their fate uncertain. Some prayed. Others made tearful goodbyes over the in-flight phone, painfully aware each word might be their last. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the steady hum of the engines. 9 hours after their scheduled arrival time, as despair reached its zenith, the plane suddenly began to descend. Passengers crowded around the windows, desperate for a glimpse of land, of rescue. The plane emerged from the clouds, and a collective gasp went up. Below them, glittering in the sun, was the unmistakable skyline of London. The Thames wound through the city like a silvery ribbon, Tower Bridge and the London Eye clearly visible. Tears of relief and joy flowed as the realization sank in somehow, miraculously, they had made it back. The pilots, it seemed, had managed to navigate them home despite the odds. As the plane touched down at Heathrow, emergency vehicles surrounded it, their lights flashing. Passengers hugged each other, laughing and crying in equal measure. They had stared into the face of their own mortality and come out the other side. In the coming days, an investigation would reveal a bizarre confluence of events, a malfunction in the plane's communication systems, combined with an unexpected jet stream that had pushed them wildly off course. The pilots would be hailed as heroes for their calm and skill under unimaginable pressure. But for the passengers of Flight 753, the experience would forever be seared into their memories. They had brushed up against the razor-thin line between life and death, had tasted the desperation of being utterly lost. And they had emerged, changed in some fundamental way, with a profound appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of life. It was a bond that would unite them forever, the knowledge that they had faced the void together and, against all odds, had found their way back to solid ground. In the weeks and months that followed, the passengers of Flight 753 struggled to readjust to normal life. They were hailed as miracles in the media, their faces splashed across newspapers and television screens. But behind the brave smiles and tearful reunions, a deeper trauma lingered. Many found themselves gripped by a newfound fear of flying, the mere thought of boarding a plane sending them into a spiral of panic. Some sought therapy to process the emotional toll of their ordeal. Others found solace in each other, forming a tight-knit support group bonded by their shared experience. Captain Thompson and First Officer Stevens, once they had recovered from their own shock, became minor celebrities in the aviation world. They gave interviews and lectures, sharing the lessons they had learned in those harrowing hours. But even they were not immune to the psychological fallout, often waking in the night drenched in sweat, the memory of those endless hours of uncertainty still vivid in their minds. For all of them, life had taken on a new fragility, a new preciousness. They had been given a second chance, a gift that many others lost in similar circumstances were not granted, and they were determined not to waste it. Some made drastic life changes, quitting unfulfilling jobs, mending broken relationships, chasing long-held dreams. Others found meaning in smaller moments: a sunrise, a child's laughter, a warm embrace. They had stared into the abyss and come back changed, more aware than ever of the fleeting nature of existence. And as the years passed and the sharp edges of memory began to dull, they would still gather on the anniversary of that fateful day. They would raise a toast to those hours that had changed them forever, to the bond they shared, to the simple, profound fact of their survival. Because they knew, in a way that few others could understand, that life was a gift, a precious and precarious thing. And having come so close to losing it, they were determined to live each day to its fullest, to savor each moment, each breath. The scars of Flight 753 would never fully fade, but they had also given rise to something else of fierce, unshakable appreciation for the beauty and fragility of life. And that, in the end, was perhaps the most enduring legacy of their unforgettable journey. Turbulence. The red-eye flight from New York to London was supposed to be routine for seasoned traveler Jack Thompson. He had made this transatlantic journey countless times for business, but tonight felt different as he settled into his first-class seat. The plane took off smoothly, but an hour into the flight, it began to shudder and shake violently. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." Jack gripped his armrests tightly as the plane jerked and bounced like a rag doll in the grip of an angry toddler. Gasps and whimpers emanated from the passengers around him. He glanced out the window and saw only inky blackness, no comforting city lights glimmering below, just a void. The plane felt like a flimsy tin can compared to the vast, uncaring expanse of the night sky. A sudden jolt knocked over a flight attendant in the aisle, sending her tumbling. Overhead compartments popped open, spewing luggage. The plane nosedived sharply and people screamed. Jack's stomach lurched into his throat. The turbulence was relentless, tossing the plane about like a leaf in a storm. He'd flown through rough air before, but nothing like this. Cold sweat dripped down his back as a primal fear gripped him, the realization of how fragile human life was at 35,000 feet, how completely powerless he was to the forces of nature buffeting the plane. People cried and prayed around him, but the roar of the engines drowned out their desperate pleas. Then came a sound far more terrifying than the screams, a loud crack like a gunshot that reverberated through the cabin. The plane lurched to the side and more panicked yells erupted. The wing. "The wing is damaged," a woman shrieked. Jack craned his neck to look out the window and his heart seized. The tip of the wing was bent at an unnatural angle, pieces of metal flapping in the wind. A jagged crack ran through one of the windows a few rows back and spider-webbed across the glass. The cabin pressure had held for now, but for how long? The plane felt like it was coming apart at the seams, pummeled by the invisible fists of the storm raging outside. The flight attendants tried to maintain calm, but fear was etched on their faces. Jack's mind reeled as he considered the catastrophic structural damage, remembering every plane crash story he'd ever read. Would the wing snap off entirely? Would the cracked window give way, causing explosive decompression? His lungs burned as he sucked in rapid, panicked breaths. The turbulence continued ruthlessly, the damaged aircraft groaning and shaking. Jack pictured the plane ripping apart in midair, imagined the long plummet to the unforgiving ocean below, and sheer terror overwhelmed him. Was this how it would end, his life snuffed out in a horrific instant, his body forever lost to the depths of the Atlantic? The captain's voice came on again, taut with tension but struggling to project calm. "This is your captain speaking. We've experienced structural damage due to the severe turbulence and will be making an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport. Flight crew, please prepare the cabin." A ripple of fearful murmurs passed through the passengers, but a tiny spark of hope kindled in Jack's chest. The skill of pilots was the only thing standing between them and disaster now. He thought of his wife and daughter at home in London, praying he would survive to see their faces again. The plane banked hard to the right, the damaged wing shuddering. Flight attendants hurried through the aisles, securing galleys and checking that seatbelts were fastened. Tense minutes ticked by as the aircraft limped through the storm under the tenuous control of the pilots. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane emerged from the clouds and Jack glimpsed the welcome sight of runway lights below. The aircraft wobbled and listed drunkenly as it lined up for final approach. He braced himself against the seat, every muscle rigid. The wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-rattling jolt, and the plane bounced once, twice, before settling onto the runway with a screech of tires. The engines roared as the pilots hit the brakes hard, throwing the passengers forward against their seatbelts. Jack watched in horror as the damaged wing scraped against the ground, sending up a shower of sparks. After an agonizingly long deceleration, the plane finally came to a shuddering stop. For a moment, there was only shocked silence in the cabin. Then a ragged cheer went up as the reality of their survival sank in. They had made it battered and shaken, but alive. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights surrounded the crippled plane as the passengers deplaned onto the tarmac on wobbly legs. Paramedics tended to the injured while firefighters sprayed foam on the damaged wing as a precaution. Jack stumbled down the air stairs, his knees weak with relief. Inside the terminal, the passengers huddled together in shocked silence, processing the trauma of what they'd just endured. Jack overheard snatches of conversation, people swearing never to fly again, thanking God for sparing their lives, calling loved ones with trembling voices to say they were okay. He collapsed into a chair, his whole body shaking as the adrenaline drained away. He thought of how close they'd come to a catastrophic disaster, how slim the margin had been between life and death. The randomness and unfairness of it all made him feel sick. In the coming days, the story of the harrowing flight would make international news. Aviation authorities would launch an investigation into the cause of the damage. The airline would issue statements commending the skill of the pilots and the bravery of the crew. The passengers would give tearful interviews, recount their near-death experience. But for Jack, as he sat in the terminal and stared blankly into space, all he could think was that he had stared into the face of his own mortality in those terrifying minutes on the plane. He felt profoundly changed, like he would never look at life the same way again. The preciousness and precariousness of existence had been made viscerally, terrifyingly clear. He knew that in the future, every time he boarded a plane, every time the seatbelt sign lit up, he would remember this night, the night he almost lost everything. He would remember the feeling of utter helplessness in the grip of forces beyond his control. And he would hold his loved ones a little tighter, appreciate the simple joys of being alive a little more. Because sometimes, all that stood between life and oblivion was a wing and a prayer, and the skill of those entrusted to carry you safely through the storm. It was a humbling, terrifying truth, one that Jack would carry with him for the rest of his days.